I'm now going to give you a completely superficial overview of Iranian history in about 5 minutes. Because that's the thing about Iranian history. It goes way back. And I mean all the way back to essentially the beginning of recorded history. Because at the end of the day, Iranians have always been really big on paperwork. It's not just that their history goes all the way back, but their written history goes all the way back. And so we have a lot to say and talk about. This image here is a picture of the Cyrus Cylinder, which some people cite as one of the first declarations of universal human rights. Now, that might be a little anachronistic, but the cylinder does record the assistance given to the peoples of Babylonia by the Persian king Cyrus after he conquered them. On a side note, the cylinder does remain very controversial, not because of what it says, but because it's located in the British Museum and it's something that the Iranian government would really like to get back. When we talk about Iranian history, we always have to start with what we usually refer to as the Persian Empire. This is the Achaemenid Empire, the Persia of Cyrus, of Dariush, of Xerxes. The Achaemenid Empire is mostly notable because they built Persepolis as one of their original capitals, and it stretched from Greece to India. This was the furthest extent that Persia ever ruled in the world. So now we're going to skip 1,000 years or so. Empires rose, empires fell. We'll talk about the next really significant event in Iranian history, and that's the Arab conquest. At this time, Iran was ruled by the Sassanids. These guys were notable because they had made Zoroastrianism the state religion and had an extremely sophisticated and complex bureaucracy. This bureaucracy, however, had begun to decline into corruption, and the caliphs coming out of the Arabian Peninsula were extremely successful in conquering first Baghdad, then Isfahan, then obviously points further north and east. And from this point on, Iran is part of the Muslim world. So we'll skip another 1,000 years or so. Again, empires rose, empires fell, and talk about the Safavids. The Safavid Empire is incredibly important because it's at this time that Iran becomes Shia. The Safavids made Twelver Shi'ism their official religion and the official religion of the state. And this led to the conversion of almost everyone inside their borders to Shi'ism itself. This is also, you will note, the time when Iranian leaders abandoned really luscious curly beards as their status symbol and moved on to truly fabulous mustaches. To wrap up really quickly, after the Safavids came the Qajar dynasty. The Qajar dynasty is mostly notable because at this time Iran gained its current borders. It lost little bits of territory to England, it lost little bits of territory to Russia. It's also notable because it was under the Qajars that Iran began to take its first steps towards democracy, or at least constitutionalism. In 1905, they had what is called the Constitutional Revolution, and it was at that point that the Shah actually had to adopt a formal constitution and have a real parliament for the first time. But, things happened, history gets a little complicated here, but long story short, after a coup in 1921, Reza Pahlavi assumed the throne, becoming Reza Shah. He was the father of the last Shah of Iran, and this kind of brings us up to the history that we'll be talking about in class. So just to wrap up, Iran has an incredibly long history and an incredibly rich culture that they are justifiably proud of, and we'll be seeing how these things play out over the rest of the semester.